This is one of the reasons I come to these events is the confidence builder. We heard the people saying, how do you share? You build your confidence. You build your confidence. And how I build my confidence is listening to the Scientific Advisory Board talk about the benefit of these products and what they've done to create these amazing products that change our lives. And one of the things I love is the integrity of our Scientific Advisory Board. This next gentleman, I think they call him Dr. Abs, but he is an amazing man. He lives the product. He also, I found out, worked with another company that brought him in. I'm not going to name names, but they brought him in because they recognized his strengths. But what he didn't recognize is that they looked really good on the outside, but when he started digging deeper into the company, he realized this isn't something I can endorse. And a reputation you build over a lifetime, and you don't want to lose that reputation by aligning with the wrong company. And so he made a hard decision. He walked away from that because he knew he had to do what was right. And once John Miller found this gentleman, he locked onto him because of the wisdom that he had and the integrity that he had. And what he's going to share today is going to change all of our lives. So thank you so much, Todd Miller, for coming and sharing with us and taking the time. Stand up, folks. Give them a welcome.
Well, thanks for having me, everybody. Let me make sure that I'm not going to fall off the stage again. Okay, so, yeah, if you were in Nashville, you saw me fall off the stage. All right, so I'm going to talk about fad diets today, and I don't have a lot of time. 15 minutes is not enough time to talk about fad diets, so I'm only really going to talk about two of them. This is my definition of fad diet. I couldn't really find one, so I just made one up. Short-term eating strategy, and a fad diet, like the ones I'm going to talk about today, don't necessarily check all these boxes, but they're close enough. And there's sort of a continuum of fad diets. Like today I'm going to talk about the ketogenic diet, I'm going to talk about intermittent fasting, which are both very popular diets. They fit some of these sort of criteria, but they're not like have you ever heard of the Sleeping Beauty diet? The Sleeping Beauty diet, listen to this. The Sleeping Beauty diet it's old, it was from like the 70s or something like that, but people would endorse taking tranquilizers to sleep like half the day so you couldn't eat. Now, will that work? Sure it'll work, right? I mean, if you're only awake half the time, you're probably gonna eat not as much. But is it smart? No. Is it sustainable? Probably not. Okay, so as we're talking about these things, I want you to mainly think about sustainability. Are these things that you can do long term? Because if they're not gonna work, okay? And I'm going to give two other presentations this weekend, and they all sort of are related. So try and keep these things in mind as we move forward. So all diets work if you burn more calories than you eat, okay? It's a very simple sort of equation. Now, how you accomplish that varies, and that can be challenging, but anything will work if it results in a calorie deficit, okay? Now up here you see a little scale and you have your calorie intake and your calorie output. And your intake is basically how much fat, protein, carb, and alcohol are you consuming. And you can see the calorie number per gram next to those macronutrients, okay? And notice like fat has 9 calories per gram. Fat has the most it's the most nutrient dense in terms of calorie dense food that you could eat. Your calorie output is determined by your metabolic rate, the cost of digestion. So when you eat food, that speeds up your metabolism. Did you ever eat a real big meal and you get all hot and sweaty afterward? That's because your metabolism is speeding up digesting it, okay? It's called the thermic effect of food. And then you have physical activity, which is your intentional exercise and pretty much everything you're doing throughout the day. And your weight is basically the net result of those two things. How much do you eat versus how much do you burn? And that's a very important fact that people seem to gloss over when it comes to these dieting strategies because they don't really worry about caloric intake. They're worrying more about what am I eating, okay? Ketogenic diet, let's talk about that. This is the belle of the ball, okay? So the history of the ketogenic diet, Hippocrates realized that if people fasted, epileptics, if they fasted, they stopped having seizures, okay? And it wasn't really that they're eating fewer calories, it's that they were eating less carbohydrate. So in the 20s, doctors began using the ketogenic diet to treat epilepsy. That was what it was for. Okay, when people stopped eating carbohydrate and only ate the majority of their calories from fat, then their seizures stopped, okay? It started to be used as a weight loss intervention in the 60s because people realized that if I decreased my carbohydrate intake, I lost weight. We'll talk about mechanistically why that is. So the basic premise is that if I eat mainly fat, if I eat a high-fat diet, it's going to result in greater fat burning than a conventional diet. Now keep in mind, right now, you're all sitting here and you're burning about 50-50 fat and carb, okay? So if you stop eating carbohydrate and you stop giving yourself that fuel source, you can only store about 2,000 calories worth of carbohydrate in your body at any time. It's stored in the muscle and liver. If you stop eating it, you deplete it. And if you replace that with fat, well, then of course you're going to burn more fat. But it doesn't necessarily mean you're burning the fat on your body. You could just be burning the excess fat that you're eating, right? So the fact that you're burning fat doesn't necessarily mean that you're burning body fat, okay? And it's an important distinction. So under normal conditions, as I said, about 50% come from carbohydrate. And if you limit that, it forces the body to burn a product called ketones. And ketones are made from fat, okay? So you will end up burning more fat because you're not eating that other source of fuel, okay? So the other thing that keto does is if you eat a really high amount of fat and don't eat a lot of carbohydrate, it releases hormones that make you feel full. And one of these is a hormone called cholecystokinin, CCK. And if you have a greater release of CCK, you're not going to be hungry and then you're not going to eat as much, okay? And that's the main mechanism by which the ketogenic diet works, okay? It works because if you are truly in ketosis, you won't be as hungry and you won't eat as much. So it's really just another method of calorie restriction. And as I said, any diet that works is a calorie restriction program. That's how it works. There's no exceptions. All right, so ketones, now just briefly, when you eat dietary fat and you're not eating carbohydrate, that fat goes to the liver and it's converted to ketones, and these ketones can be burned by the brain. So normally your brain likes to burn sugar. It likes to burn glucose and it cannot burn fat. Fat can't cross into the brain, but ketones can. So if you suddenly stopped eating carbohydrate, if you didn't have the ability to create ketones, you'd be dead because your brain wouldn't be getting any fuel. So this is sort of a survival mechanism, right? So the body is converting this fat into ketones, and that's going into then the brain can burn those things. Now, to really know if you're in ketosis, you have to check your blood like with a keto strip, right? And you can measure these circulating ketones in the blood. The other thing that happens is you can urinate out ketones. So you're actually peeing calories into the toilet, okay? Now, it's not that much, but over time, that can be significant. Okay, so this is a 1,500 calorie ketogenic diet. So take a look at this and keep in mind the issue here is sustainability. So let's say for breakfast, I had eggs and bacon and butter and some strawberries, and then for lunch, I had avocado, pepperoni, some cheese, some ranch dressing, a snack of peanut butter and walnuts, and then for dinner, I had a cheeseburger with no bun and some more avocado on a salad with no dressing. That's 77% of your calories from fat. I don't know if you ever tried to do that, but it's nasty. I think I had a hard time trying to eat that much fat, right? And it's hard to make a ketogenic diet because you also have to keep the protein kind of low, because if protein is too high, protein will actually get converted to carbohydrate. That's beyond the scope of this, so don't worry about that. But the point is, protein has to be low, and that's important because we're going to come back to that later on. So ask yourself, can you do this long term? So this is a guy that we were working with who decided he was going to go on a ketogenic diet for 100 days. And this is a DEXA scan. So a DEXA is a way to measure body fat. And you can see on the left picture, the guy has a lot of yellow here and red. Yellow are areas of moderate fat, red are areas of high fat, and green is muscle, okay? So the black, my thing's not working here, but you see the black and the red line on the chart there. He has 3 test points here. And The second test point is where he starts the ketogenic diet. And on that graph is a red line and a black line that shows fat mass and fat-free mass, which is muscle. And you can see that when he starts the ketogenic diet, both of those things plummet, fat and muscle, okay? So here's the results on an easier to digest table. So you can see day 1 what his body weight was, day 100 what his body weight was, and the change. And his weight dropped 40 pounds. He lost 30 pounds of fat, which is awesome. Yeah, but he also lost 10 pounds of muscle. Now, the important thing here is the last thing on here, which you see this thing RMR, that's resting metabolic rate. That's how many calories you're burning per day if you were to just sit here and do nothing. So this guy was burning 2,400 calories when he started per day, which means he's burning 100 calories an hour just being alive. And that was 10% faster than the predicted value for his size and gender and weight. There are prediction equations to calculate this stuff. In addition to actually measuring it, we actually measured it. After his 100 days, you can see what happens. His metabolism is now 2,077. It's actually 14% slower than predicted. So he's burning 330 calories less per day than he was before he started. And this is because of fallen metabolism, because he's not eating enough. He's eating 1,500 calories a day, but his resting metabolic rate is 2,400. He's in a 900 calorie deficit before he even moves. So if he starts exercising, let's say he burns 300 calories of exercise through the day. Now he's in a 1,200 calorie deficit. It's not enough food. He can't maintain his muscle mass with a 2,400 calorie RMR if he's only going to be eating 1,500 calories. The deficit's too big, okay? And this is what happens, which is bad, right? Because if your metabolism falls, that means you're burning fewer calories, and it's harder to stay in a deficit when you're burning 330 less calories per day, okay? Okay, so these are some additional areas of concern. I don't want to talk too much about this. Things that, like fatty liver, most of these things have been seen in animal studies because it's hard to do those kinds of invasive things on people. People who have obesity and diabetes, those people generally have shown to have health improvements on a ketogenic diet. But you got to look at, it's sort of the lesser of two evils. You know, you have diabetes and obesity, that's a problem. If those health markers improve as a result of the ketogenic diet, then maybe the benefits of the ketogenic diet outweigh the risks. But that may not be true if you're not obese and not a diabetic and you just have 5 or 10 extra pounds you want to lose, right? If you do that, then potentially you could have problems, okay? All right, so what are the conclusions about the ketogenic diet? It wasn't designed to be a weight loss intervention. You have to eat more than 75% of your calories from fat, which a lot of people have a hard time doing. And the final thing that you should remember is ketogenic dieting is the most restrictive eating strategy you can have, right? Because you have to eliminate almost all carbohydrates and you have to eliminate a lot of protein, which means there's not a lot left, right? And the more restrictive a diet is, the less sustainable it is. That's across the board true, okay? And sustainability is the key to success. All right, so now we're going to talk about intermittent fasting. And there are 3 sort of types of this. There's alternate day fasting, which is just like it sounds. You don't eat on one day, then you eat whatever you want on the next day, or you're eating like less than 25% of your normal caloric intake. Then there's periodic fasting, which is complete fasting for greater than 24 hours, and this usually consists of multiple days of fasting. So you might like fast 2 days a week completely, then eat the other 5. And then the one that most people do is called time-restricted feeding. When people say intermittent fasting, what they're really usually talking about is time-restricted feeding, where you have this window. So let's say you're only going to eat from 12 to 5, okay? But you can eat whatever you want and as much as you want. That's the idea behind intermittent fasting, okay? So here's some example protocols: alternating days, time-restricted, and periodic. So look at the time-restricted one, which is in the middle. So let's say you're going to do a 16 to 20-hour fast and a 4 or 8-hour feed, somewhere in there, okay? That's a typical protocol. Now, the way this works is if I don't eat from 5 to noon, when I go in at noon, I'm going to be pretty hungry. And let's say I eat 1,200, 1,300 calories in that meal. I'm probably not going to want to eat a whole lot during that 5-hour window after that because I'm going to be full. So when dinner rolls around, maybe I eat another 1,000 calories, and maybe throughout the whole day I only eat 2,200 calories. But maybe normally I eat 2,500. So now I'm in a 300-calorie deficit just because I made the eating window smaller. Okay? So the claim here is that if you have abstinence from food short term, that decreases your insulin levels and blood glucose, it increases whole body fat burning. Well, that's true, but that's true when you woke up this morning. When you woke up this morning, you hadn't eaten all night, so you had low levels of insulin, your body was burning more fat. That's how it works, right? So there's nothing really magical about this. If you calorie restrict, you're going to create a deficit. It's just easier to create that deficit if you only give yourself 5 hours to eat. Okay? So if we look at this graph shows the effects of intermittent fasting on weight loss, and you can see there's one group that essentially doesn't change over a 12-week period, and the other group loses about 3% of their body weight. So for me, that would be like 5 pounds, somewhere around that. And if that all comes from fat in 12 weeks, that's good, because 5 pounds of fat takes up a lot of space. But the important thing here is look at the energy intake. They reduced their energy intake by 350 calories a day on average. So again, if you're eating less and creating a deficit, that is going to lead to weight loss. Okay? So what are the conclusions here? If you shorten the feeding window, yeah, that does seem to have an advantage in mobilizing and utilizing fat stores, but only if you create a calorie deficit. Okay? The other problem is if let's say you're on like a periodic fast where you're taking 2 days off that week, fasting, not eating anything, you run the risk of losing some muscle if your protein intake is too low, right? And you run the risk of having too low of a protein intake if you're not eating 2 of those 5 days. So, that can potentially be problematic. And it's probably the case that, and this has been shown, that let's say somebody eats 2,500 calories during their 5-hour window. If somebody else eats 2,500 calories during their whole day, the weight loss is exactly the same. Okay, so there's nothing about the fasting period that's magical. The fasting period has to induce the calorie deficit. And if that calorie deficit is the same as any other type of eating strategy, then the weight loss is going to be exactly the same. Now, where that weight comes from, fat or muscle, can vary, and we'll talk about that later on. But all these things work based on calorie restriction and creating a deficit. Nothing else. Okay? And people seem to forget that. They think that it's more important what I eat, not so much how much I eat. And what you really should be concerned with first is how many calories am I taking in, and then what's the macronutrient distribution, which we could talk about later on. Okay. So what's the best diet? These are this is my last slide. So the top graph is a bunch of studies looking at low-fat diets, and the bottom graph is a bunch of studies looking at low-carbohydrate diets. And it's basically plotting weight change. And you can see that those two graphs look identical, right? When the calorie deficit is equal, it doesn't matter whether you cut carbs or cut fat. The weight loss is the same. It's the calorie restriction that determines the weight loss, not what you're eating. So the best diet here is whichever one you can stick to. Whichever diet you can stick to for the longest period of time is going to be the one that's most successful. Unfortunately, there aren't many that you can stick to long term. Anybody who tries to lose weight, 95% of those people will gain it all back in a year. Okay, so even well thought out diet plans often don't work because it relies on permanent behavior change, which is very, very difficult for people to do. Okay? I'm 2.5 minutes over. I don't have time for questions, but thanks, everybody. I'll be around, so please come up and talk to me.
I love how you shared that about the keto, because I was talking to a guy this week, Thursday, who had lost weight with keto. And I go, so did it give you energy? And he goes, no, I felt like crud. I'm like, well, it's working. To me, a diet, like you said, it's not sustainable if you feel like crud. Like you said, he had no energy, he felt horrible, and he did lose muscle. And I know Joel has mentioned in the past his wonderful experience with keto. I just look at it, and you have to have something that's sustainable, something that you could continue to do, and something that gives you energy. That's the other thing. I've met so many people on our weight loss, their energy levels skyrocket while they're burning fat. And to me, that is a win-win. Thank you, Todd, so much for sharing that information. Bunch of good stuff.